The wine was still warm from their masters' lips when the slaves first tasted it. Lifted crystal goblets with hands that had once hauled stones, scrubbed floors, carried amphorae in the grand halls of Roman villas. Torchlight danced off marble columns like trapped lightning. Here roles reversed, at least for a time. Masters knelt before slaves, offering platters of honeyed dates and roasted peacock, their silken togas whispering across cold stone as they bowed their heads. Delicacies once forbidden were now presented like peace offerings. But watch the hands. The slaves' fingers trembled as they gripped those priceless goblets, the same hands scarred and calloused by years of labor, now holding something worth more than their entire bodies had fetched at auction. Their laughter came in short, measured bursts like water from a reluctant spring, each word uttered under command to speak freely. Even rebellion had its limits, its stage, its script. Rage, wrapped in nervous smiles, anger, recited like a joke. The festival had begun. This was Saturnalia. For 7 carefully measured days, the empire's most disposable property was permitted to feel something close to human. It was Rome's grand gesture, counterfeit freedom dressed in festival colors. And yet, in the dim candlelight, something else moved beneath the surface. The trembling never stopped. Wine spilled. Smiles cracked. The body remembered what the mind was told to forget. They called it liberation. But the chains were not broken, only polished and set aside for cleaning. At dawn on the 17th of December, bronze bells rang out across the 7 hills. The inversion began, scheduled with the precision of a census. Slaves were allowed to mock their masters, but only in designated forums, using the right words, during set hours. These were truths that, on any other day, would earn a crucifixion. The reversal was unsettling, not for its chaos but for its control. Masters bowed, slaves commanded, but the eyes of the powerful never lost their sharpness. They catalogued every gesture of their equals as if memorizing evidence. Even submission became surveillance. In kitchens choked with smoke, slaves stumbled over their new roles. Their commands emerged like uncertain prayers. Decades of silence had carved their throats into instruments of obedience and fit for issuing orders. They could ask for anything: food, drink, entertainment, if in vengeance, but their voices wavered. Apologies tucked behind every request. The body, it turned out, could be taught to forget freedom. Each morning brought permissions like military orders. Noon granted new privileges. Sunset removed them without announcement. Revolution by the Roman clock. At sundown, it all vanished, not slowly, but all at once, like a dream waking into chains. The spine remembers. Elderly slaves who tried to sit in their masters' chairs found their backs bent into permanent question marks. Their hands reached 4 golden cups with the fluttering hesitation of birds approaching a trap. Even the taste of luxury made them sick. Hunger they understood. Fullness they did not. Children born into bondage watched it all with confused wonder. What did freedom mean to a mind that had never seen it? What was choice to those raised with none? They watched their elders struggle with simple decisions: where to sit, what to eat, how to speak. They learned that liberty wasn't instinct. It was a language, and they hadn't been taught it. The truth was brutal. Temporary equality could feel heavier than permanent servitude. The act of choosing when you've never had to could crush the soul faster than the whip. Some slaves retreated from the celebration, overwhelmed by its weight. Others froze, caught in the doorway between what was familiar and what was fleeting. It was in those moments that Saturnalia revealed its darkest truth, the most effective. Chains are not forged in iron, they are grown, cell by cell, into the body, into breath, into belief. And still, the show went on. The same amphitheaters that once echoed with screams of slaves devoured by lions now hosted new performances. Makeshift wooden stages were raised in villa gardens. Slaves dressed in masks and painted costumes performed comedies that mocked their masters, lampooning their cruelty, their vanity, their divine pretensions. Laughter roared from the audience. Masters clapped, their families howling with glee at exaggerated imitations of their own brutal commands. Crucify him. A character would shout, imitating a real master's tone, and the crowd erupted. It was entertainment, but it was also engineering. This was Rome's masterpiece, not its roads, not its aqueducts, not even its legions. Saturnalia was social genius, a holiday that vented the pressure of injustice by turning rage into theater, a festival that diffused rebellion with applause. The rage of the enslaved became comedy. Their pain became plot points. Their truth, when spoken, only mattered if it amused. Even the stage told the deeper story. Slaves stood higher than their masters, but only because they stood on wooden platforms. Platforms that could be taken down between acts, just props, just temporary illusions of elevation. And when the final line was delivered, when the final goblet drained, when the final cheer faded into silence, the slaves stepped down. The masks came off. The chains returned. The applause was real. So was the bondage. Their masters had built speaking lines. Their masters had approved performing rebellion. Their masters had scheduled the theater ended when the powerful decided it ended. Even the slave actors' bows at the end of each show contained the truth. They bent low before an audience that owned not just their bodies but their resistance. not just their labor but their very capacity for defiance in the flickering torchlight as painted slaves. Delivered practice speeches about freedom, the real revolution died laughing every night. The platforms were dismantled every morning, they were rebuilt for the next performance. The rebellion was portable, scheduled, and completely under management. The audience never changed, only the actors believed. They had the bronze bells that had announced liberation now told its execution. No trumpet fanfare accompanied the transition, no ceremony marked the boundary between freedom and bondage at dawn. On the 25th day of December, when the winter sun crept over the Palatine Hill like a reluctant witness, the festival simply ended, not through negotiation or gradual withdrawal, but with the absolute finality of breath leaving a corpse. The transformation happened with mechanical precision that would have impressed Rome's finest engineers' voices that had grown strong over 7 days of temporary authority shrank back to whispers so automatic that the vocal cords seemed to contract without conscious command. Spines that had straightened during moments of permitted dignity curved again into familiar arcs of deference, vertebrae falling into apologetic positions as naturally as stones settling into foundations. Hands that had grown comfortable with luxury returned to positions of submission, palms open, fingers loose, ready to receive orders or blows with equal acceptance. In kitchens where the smell of last night's feast still lingered in air heavy with olive oil and wine-soaked bread, slaves who had spent a week giving orders now waited for commands with the patience of people who had never questioned the source of their next breath. The temporary masters became servants again, without resistance, without complaint, without even the shadow of disappointment crossing faces that had learned to express nothing that might be interpreted as discontent. The efficiency of the return was perhaps more disturbing than the festival itself had been. Bodies that had tasted freedom adapted back to bondage as easily as changing clothes, as naturally as water flowing downhill toward the sea. The muscle memory of submission reasserted itself, like an old injury responding to changes in weather, automatic, inevitable, and somehow comforting in its familiarity. The psychological reset was equally complete, equally efficient. Conversations that had flowed freely between master and slave during Saturnalia simply stopped, as if the ability to speak across the social divide had been a temporary illness that had finally broken its fever. Eye contact that had been permitted, even encouraged, during the festival became impossible. Again, not forbidden by new commands, but simply unthinkable, like trying to breathe underwater or walk through solid stone. The very notion that these interactions had ever taken place began to feel like memories borrowed from someone else's life. Had they really sat in their master's chairs? Had they really given orders to people who owned them? Had they really tasted food meant for free mouths, slept in beds designed for human bodies rather than property? The experiences felt distant as childhood dreams, as insubstantial as morning mist rising from the Tiber. Most unsettling was the sense of relief that accompanied the return, not the bitter relief of prisoners whose torture has finally ended, but the genuine comfort of people returning home after an exhausting journey to a foreign country where they had never learned to speak the language properly. For many slaves, the weight of decision-making had been more crushing than the weight of chains. The responsibility of choice had required energy that survival had never permitted them to develop. Freedom that they discovered was work. Bondage, at least, was familiar labor that their bodies and minds had been trained to perform efficiently. Masters, too, settled back into their roles with visible satisfaction that manifested in relaxed shoulders and easier breathing. The experiment in temporary humanity had been interesting, even entertaining, but normal service had resumed. Orders could flow again in their proper directions without the awkwardness of recent equality. Punishment could be administered without the complicated memory of shared laughter. The natural order, the Roman order, the only order that made sense in a world built from conquest and maintained through control, had reasserted itself like sun rising after an eclipse. In the weeks following Saturnalia, something extraordinary occurred in the villas and workshops scattered across Rome's 7 hills. Slaves began to express gratitude, not the forced appreciation that came with whips and brands, not the calculated submission that prevented worse punishments, but genuine thankfulness for their temporary elevation to the ranks of the human. They spoke of the festival as a gift in voices that carried no trace of irony or hidden resentment. They thanked their masters for the privilege of 7 days humanity with the same earnestness that free citizens thank the gods for good harvests or successful military campaigns. The appreciation lived in their eyes when they recalled moments of permitted dignity, the taste of wine that had never touched slaves' lips, the feel of silk that had never warmed slaves' skin, the sound of their own voices speaking words that carried weight rather than simply noise. It manifested in their behavior as increased loyalty that went beyond the mechanical obedience of broken spirits. They worked harder than they had before the festival, but their labor carried a different quality, the eager efficiency of people who felt they owed a debt to the world rather than the desperate productivity of people who feared the lash. They complained less, resisted less, plotted escape less frequently. When they spoke of their masters to other slaves, their words contained something that sounded disturbingly like affection. This was not manipulation in the crude sense of threat and reward that other civilizations had attempted. This was not the temporary suppression of rebellion through exhaustion or terror. This was engineering at the level of the soul, architecture that reconstructed the inner landscape of human consciousness itself by offering slaves a taste of what they had lost. Rome had made them accomplices in their own subjugation by giving them something to lose it, had given them something to be grateful for by making freedom conditional. It had made slavery feel voluntary. The slaves who had experienced Saturnalia worked with different rhythms than those who had not. Their movements carried a subtle satisfaction, as if they were participating in something larger than their individual suffering. They had been trusted with temporary authority. They had been included in the social mechanism. Even if only as movable parts, they belonged to something greater than their own pain. They belonged to Rome itself, the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Children who witnessed the festival learned lessons no philosophy teacher could provide. They absorbed the understanding that freedom was not a right that belonged to humans by virtue of breathing, but a privilege that could be granted or withdrawn by those with the wisdom and power to make such decisions. They grew up knowing that liberty was something that could be given and taken away, not something that existed in their bodies, like blood or breath. The most successful slaves began to see themselves as partners in the Roman system rather than victims of it. They had been chosen for special treatment. They had been deemed worthy of trust. They had been permitted to glimpse the machinery of power from the inside, to understand how decisions were made, how order was maintained, how civilization functioned. This knowledge made them valuable, made them special, made them different from the ordinary property that never received such education. When they looked at newly purchased slaves fresh from the market, still carrying the wild desperation of people who had not yet learned to accept their circumstances, the veterans of Saturnalia felt something that might have been pity or might have been superiority. They knew something these newcomers did not, that resistance was pointless because the system was just. The festival had proven it. Masters who granted freedom, even temporarily, could not be tyrants. Owners who shared their luxury, even briefly, could not be monsters. The psychological alchemy was complete. Temporary freedom had made permanent bondage feel not just tolerable but reasonable, not just survivable but fair. Rome had solved the ancient problem of human bondage: how to own people without them hating you for it. Other civilizations had tried brutality. The Spartans had created helots who lived in permanent terror. The Egyptians had worked slaves to death, building monuments to vanity. The Greeks had treated human property as talking tools that required constant supervision. Rome tried something different. Rome tried hope. The festival of Saturnalia was not an accident of tradition or a relic of earlier customs inherited from conquered peoples. It was a deliberately engineered social technology, as carefully designed as Roman roads that connected every corner of the empire, or Roman aqueducts that carried mountain water to desert cities. It served a specific function in the machinery of conquest and control: to prevent rebellion by providing the illusion of justice, to maintain slavery by offering controlled tastes of freedom, to make oppression bearable by making it seem temporary and voluntary. The genius was mathematical in its precision, as calculated as the angles of archstones that supported amphitheater domes. 7 days of reversal per year created exactly enough pressure released to prevent explosive resistance, but not enough sustained change to threaten the fundamental architecture of power. The timing was perfect, long enough to feel real and meaningful, short enough to remain manageable and contained. The frequency was optimal, annual enough to provide hope that sustained morale, rare enough to maintain its special status and prevent expectations of regular equality. Other societies watched Rome's success and learned to copy its innovations. The model spread beyond the empire's borders, adapted to local customs and traditions, but retaining its essential function as a safety valve for social pressure. Controlled rebellion became a tool of governance, exported like Roman wine or Roman coins. Managed revolution became a method of maintaining order that proved more effective than armies or walls. The permission to resist, when properly regulated and contained within acceptable boundaries, became more powerful than the prohibition of resistance. The psychological architecture was flawless in its understanding of human nature. Slaves who experienced temporary freedom became more invested in the system that provided it than slaves who experienced only oppression. They had something to lose beyond their lives. They had memories of dignity, tastes of pleasure, moments of agency that could be withdrawn if they proved unworthy of such gifts. They had something to hope for beyond death, not escape or revolution, but the annual return of their temporary humanity. They had been given reasons to wait rather than reasons to fight. Even the masters benefited, in ways they may not have fully understood at the conscious level, by occasionally serving their slaves, by temporarily surrendering their authority, by briefly inhabiting the position of the powerless. They were able to maintain the fiction that their position was earned rather than inherited. They could point to Saturnalia as evidence of their benevolence, their wisdom, their sophisticated understanding of justice and human nature. They had created a system that made them feel virtuous. While they participated in the systematic dehumanization of other people, the festival allowed them to experience mercy without ending injustice, to practice humility without surrendering power, to demonstrate their humanity without recognizing the humanity of those they owned. It was charity that cost nothing, generosity that maintained wealth, justice that preserved injustice most cunningly. It made the masters feel that they were better people than rulers who never granted such privileges, that they were enlightened rather than simply more sophisticated in their methods of control. Standing in these ruins, Now where winter wind moves through empty archways that once echoed with the laughter of the temporarily free-looking at stones, that absorbed the sweat and tears and blood of both masters and slaves, the question becomes unavoidable and terrible. Would we have been different? Would we have seen through the architecture of managed liberation? Would we have recognized the festival for what it was, a machine that transformed hope into chains, rebellion into performance, freedom into a more elegant form of bondage? Or would we too have been grateful for our 7 days of permitted humanity? Would we too have learned to love the system that occasionally allowed us to remember what we had lost? Would we too have become willing participants in our own subjugation, partners in our own oppression, grateful slaves who thanked our masters for the privilege of temporary existence as human beings rather than property? The amphitheaters are empty now, their stone seats worn smooth by centuries of rain that has washed away. The scent of blood and wine and fear grass grows between marble blocks that once supported the weight of crowds. Watching slaves mock their masters in performances that everyone understood would end at sunrise, the villas have crumbled into romantic ruins where tourists take photographs beside broken columns, documenting beauty without understanding the mechanism that created it. But the rhythm of Saturnalia persists, echoing through centuries with the persistence of water-wearing channels. Through stone, the innovation that Rome perfected, using freedom as a tool of control, hope as a method of management, temporary liberation as a technique for permanent subjugation, has been refined rather than abandoned. It operates now with such sophistication that it no longer requires festivals or formal inversions, no longer needs the crude theater of masters serving slaves. Look for it in the architecture of modern systems. The designated spaces for complaint that channel dissent into harmless directions, the scheduled times for resistance that ensure rebellion arrives when power is prepared to contain it, the permitted channels for opposition that guide rage away from the machinery that creates it, the safety valves that release pressure without threatening the engines that generate it, the illusions of choice that make powerlessness feel chosen rather than imposed. The festivals of inversion continue, though they wear different costumes now. The brief moments when the powerless are permitted to speak truth to power, when the exploited are allowed to mock their exploiters, when the controlled are given temporary access to the language of control, these moments serve the same function they served in Roman villas. They make the system feel responsive, just capable of self-correction. They prove that those who rule are enlightened enough to laugh at themselves, sophisticated enough to permit criticism, wise enough to manage their own power responsibly. The psychological architecture has evolved but not changed the controlled taste of agency that makes permanent powerlessness bearable, the scheduled moments of dignity that make routine humiliation tolerable, the occasional access to luxury that makes perpetual the scarcity feel reasonable, the temporary permission to speak that makes enforced silence seem voluntary, the brief experiences of equality that make structural inequality feel natural. Even the gratitude remains, though it speaks different languages. Now the appreciation for crumbs that prevents demands for bread, the thankfulness for small reforms that forestalls calls for transformation, the relief at minor concessions that makes major injustices seem survivable, the loyalty that grows from being allowed to glimpse what lies beyond the boundaries of permitted existence. The innovation of using hope as a chain has become so sophisticated that it no longer requires the crude theater of role reversal. The system has learned to make people grateful for their limitations by occasionally showing them their alternatives. It has mastered the art of making bondage feel chosen by providing controlled experiences of choice. It has perfected the technique of making oppression seem voluntary by offering carefully managed moments of power in the end. Saturnalia's lasting gift to human civilization was not the temporary liberation of Roman slaves, but the permanent enslavement of hope itself. Rome discovered that the most effective chains were not made of iron but of possibility, the possibility that things could change if one waited long enough, that justice could be achieved if one worked within the system, that freedom could be earned through patience and proper behavior and gratitude for small mercies. The slaves who experienced Saturnalia died in bondage, but they died believing their suffering had meaning. They died convinced that their patience had purpose, that their submission was a choice rather than a condition imposed by force. They died feeling that they had been partners in something greater than their individual pain, citizens, however temporarily, of the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The stones remember nothing. They absorb rain and heat and cold with equal indifference, their surfaces worn smooth by weather that cares nothing for the human stories played out against their hardness. The wind carries no voices from the past, no echoes of laughter or screams or the subtle sound of chains being polished for special occasions, but the pattern persists, as reliable as seasons, as predictable as sunrise, as enduring as the roads and aqueducts that outlasted the empire that built them. Somewhere in some form the festival continues. Temporary freedom still serves permanent control. Hope still functions as the most elegant of cages. Permission still shapes the boundaries of resistance. The performance never ends. Only the stage changes, only the costumes are updated, only the language adapts to new centuries, but the essential rhythm remains: the brief taste of what has been lost, the grateful return to what has been accepted, the deep satisfaction of belonging to Something larger than individual suffering. The audience never changes. Seats only. The actors believe they have been promoted. Thanks for watching.